everybody, and welcome back to Writing the Rapids, the show where I, Joe Bielecki, talk to writers about writing. Very often, those writers have been recommended to me by writers who have previously been on the show. In the case of this month's guest, Sara Century was recommended to me by Sam Richards, so if you liked those episodes, stick around for this one, and if you like this one, make sure you go back and listen to those. Sara Century is a multidisciplinary creative who works in photography, videography, art, and storytelling. She's the host of the comic book podcast Best Issue Ever and the upcoming Medusa Mask narrative horror podcast. Her book, A Small Light and Other Stories, is available through Weird Punk Books. She's been releasing zines most of her life. Most recently, a deep dive into the Scream franchise. The next will be a lengthy dissection of lesbian vampire tropes titled My Wild Heart Bleeds With Yours, to be released March 1st, 2025. You can follow her work at saracentury.com, and as always, links in the show notes. Before we get into my conversation with Sara, let's remind you that you can help out the show monetarily via Patreon, patreon.com/noisemakerjoe. For just $2 a month, you can get these episodes a little bit earlier than everybody else. You can toss me a one-time donation over at paypal.me/noisemakerjoe, or you can buy my book. It's called Tired. It's on Amazon, and it's pretty good. If you don't want to spend money, but you do want to help out the show, make sure you like, you subscribe, you hit the notification button, you repost, you reblog, you read whatever, and or tell a friend about us in person. All those things help a great deal. Now, without further ado, let's get into my conversation with Sara. So I noticed a theme in A Small Light and Other Stories, or recurring motif. And one kind of in horror in general, but particularly within your short stories, is that of a dysfunctional, abusive, or otherwise like bad relationship sort of being a core element to the story. And so I want to ask you, what do you think horror would be like if people were nicer to each other?
It's always the horror of horror, right? Is other people most of the time. Obviously, we have, scary monsters and things like that, but even that still always just feels like it's, deep down fear of other people. And I think that that's correct. I think that the relationships in A Small Light were really difficult. You really have to walk a pretty fine line, I think, whenever you're depicting something like a toxic relationship, or in some cases it is, I would say, abusive. There's definitely one relationship that is almost definitely a physically abusive relationship. And, trying to kind of like teeter like the line of going, okay, I would like to discuss this and how this affects particularly like sapphic relationships, because I think that it's not something we talk about as like anybody really talks about as something that happens. And, the idea that I sympathize, I think, with all of the characters, but then that there's, as you turn the lens, you see more about the character who's speaking and kind of a lot of the things that they have done that are also not particularly likable or good. So I do think that there's a subtlety. You can be pretty nice to people and still hurt them, right? And so I always think that that's kind of what I like to explore in horror. And as far as what it would be like if people were nicer to each other, I think it would still be what it is. I think we still need a realm to kind of discuss where humanity goes wrong, I think.
Yeah. I think particularly in like haunted house stories, like the movies, it's really very like the relationship between the man and the woman who move into this house is like barely holding together,
Yeah.
which is wild to me, because buying a house was very stressful for us. And my wife and I have, I think, an extraordinarily good relationship. And that was still stressful. Like, if we were barely holding together, there's no way we would have been able to buy a house together, let alone a sketchy haunted house. But, but yeah, I have no, I have no, I have no context really on how sapphic relationships work out. Perhaps that's obvious, but I don't. I noticed a decent amount of, I guess, what I would call infidelity, and I don't know. I don't even know why I'm couching it. I noticed that as like several of the characters in various stories throughout the book were like sleeping with other people as a means of either like trying to find an out in the relationship or at least like trigger a response from someone who's more or less catatonic.
Hmm. Yeah, no, for sure. There is a fair amount of infidelity. And what I find to be perhaps most interesting about the infidelity in all of those stories is that they're still always very obsessed with each other. And it does seem like so I would say, obviously polyamory is a thing, right? And so polyamory I would consider to be generally a pretty healthy thing. So I never wanted it to be like, oh, this is polyamory. I wanted it to be infidelity. Like I wanted it to be something that was kind of toxic and was something that was communicating a greater fear in their relationship. And the fact is, like, everybody's changing in these stories, right? So you have the fear of change, I think is probably the biggest element of all of these characters. And you're watching someone who you're close to change into somebody that you no longer recognize, right? Which is a horrifying thing. It happens to people all of the time in real life, but it can be really scary. And then, of course, in horror, you can go, well, she's changing into a monster, or she's changing into a bird god, or like whatever. And so to me, I think that the infidelity is something that is used to express not just how unstable the relationship is, but also that they're both seriously hurting from the relationship in a way that is shutting down the communication between them. And so whenever they kind of go, oh, well, I know this person's cheating on me, but I'm okay with it because I want some alone time. It's just like, to me, one of those things where, in much smaller and much more subtle ways, sometimes you can kind of like breeze over stuff in a relationship and be like, I can't deal with this right now. So you go, I'm noticing that my partner is doing this thing, but I'm not going to bring it up right now. We can talk about it later. And then I think when that kind of starts to snowball effect into a bigger problem, sometimes it feels like it's just gotten so far away from you at that point. And so I wanted it to communicate the feeling, I guess, of things getting so far away from you that you no longer can even talk about it. So the infidelity is a problem, but it's really not the biggest problem in a lot of those stories. Like
No.
the problems are everything else. And then you see these two characters that still remain completely fixated on each other, even throughout their infidelity.
Yeah. Hmm. That gives me a lot to think about. That I'm not exactly sure how to express. Um, Interesting. Every now and again. This is maybe the earliest that's happened in an episode is where I'm just completely like, oh no, I need to like sit down and like think and write about this a little bit. Um, because I don't know. I notice infidelity in literature quite a lot. Um, I never really know kind of what to do with it. Um, because it's not really been something I've had to deal with like at all in my adult life. Um, and so it's always something that I just kind of see um, other people
It's
having to deal with.
frustrating, right? Like it's one of those things where you're like, why is this character doing this? Like
Hmm.
you kind of just want them to be honest because that's how it feels in real life too. You just want someone to be honest with you. But it's that breakdown of trust, right?
Hmm.
That I think is like the root of a lot of these stories where you're scared because you can't trust the person that you trust the most anymore.
Yeah. Was it um was it the Hollow Bones where one of the women that is being or I don't know, participating in the infidelity is like standing in the doorway while the main character cradles
Yep.
and helps the other one. It's one of the things
Yeah.
too that I don't know if is something that I think about very much, is like how kind of unfair infidelity is to that person being looped into it.
Oh God, yeah. Yeah, that was kind of the point of that story is that there's all of these bystanders that get hurt like along the way. And it's just the breakdown of this kind of never really a good match couple that just cannot get over each other. And even years down the line, you see, the still not a bird god partner just obsessed with this woman and just like, everything that represents that, but she can't get away with it or get away from it like at all. Even years down the line, she's still just traumatized by this.
Yeah, absolutely. Is that's the Hollow Bones is also the one that has the line "Urban legends don't have girlfriends, do they?"
Yeah.
Which I wrote down verbatim because that's such a sick line. It's so good.
Thank you. Thank you. I was thinking about it because I'm always reading Wikipedia entries and I was just like, yeah, it's never people, right? Like we have urban legends, but it's like, that's the whole point. And of course, like stories like Candyman and stuff like that, dive way further into that. But it's this idea of something that becomes no longer a person because of how their story goes, I guess. And I always find that to be pretty interesting because, of course, like I'm in the moment, I am myself, and I'm somebody who just a regular ass person. But then, these circumstances can happen to somebody. And it happens in true crime a lot, for instance, like somebody's like, oh, the victim. And like, we don't know anything about them. We learn about the serial killer, but we never really learn about the victims too much. Right. And so that idea, I think, of how people become detached from like the legend or the image that exists of them was kind of an interesting thing to me too.
Yeah, you bring up true crime in the Scream zine, which reminded me of. Have you heard the song "Lotta True Crime" by Penelope Scott?
Is it the one? Yeah, I listen to a lot of true crime.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the one?
Yeah,
One of my friends sent that to me,
that's
actually.
funny. Because it felt almost like that bit in the Scream zine was kind of offering like a criticism to that song, right? Like
Hmm.
the idea that the conceit of the song "Lot of True Crime" is that modern women are much more prepared for serial killer men now because we've all heard, we listen to it in the morning and we listen to it at night. And so like now we know the game you're playing and can handle it. I kind of felt like there was kind of pushback on that sort of idea in the Scream zine.
Because it's not true, right? Like if somebody comes at you with a knife, you're not prepared for that. It really doesn't matter. You can be like the world's foremost martial arts expert, and you're not really prepared for somebody to dive at you with a knife. And a knife can also kill anybody. It doesn't matter who you are. So it's a very, I don't know. I wouldn't criticize it. I do enjoy that song. I think it's really funny. And I grew up reading true crime. I think true crime has changed a lot. There's a very clear like a criticism of true crime where a lot of people say, well, it's always exploitative. I don't believe that it's always exploitative. I think sometimes it is actually made by people either who knew somebody, somebody who knew somebody who died, or somebody who survived something. Like there's any number of ways that true crime can go, but then there is a very salacious side to true crime because people hear something, a serial killer, and like everybody is so dazzled by that concept that the people, like somebody like in the zine, it's Sydney Prescott, right, has
Mm-hmm.
this ongoing horrible things happening to her, and people sensationalize it. And so we never really get to know Sydney very much, I don't think, in any of those movies, because most of her story is defined by Ghostface, right? And so that's kind of the thing that I would assume that most people would want to be wary of with true crime, even if you enjoy it. Like I often do. I've read a ton of true crime.
Yeah. Yeah, I see every now and again reposts or variations on the theme of, I think, particularly making fun of the Stay Sexy and Don't Get Murdered one, where it's like, ooh, it's so spooky, spoopy, let's drink our wine, and like, but I have a hard time hating on that too much, because like at any given point there's a bunch of guys who kind of resemble me in a garage or a basement pushing around little World War II tanks and rolling dice about it. So like,
Sure, that's kind of the thing. And also, I will note that whenever it comes to My Favorite Murder,
that's the
those
one.
two, I would say that in not to go to the bat for truly anybody in this podcast, but I was going to say that essentially, if you were reading true crime before they were involved in it, there is the salacious angle, I think, was a lot more intense and it was a lot more male dominated. So you have this kind of change in what the narrative is, and for their faults, you also have to keep in mind, I think, that they have really actively, at least, like communicated with the people who have called them out. There's a lot of conversations on their podcast, I think, about that.
Mm.
And so, once again, I'm not saying it's perfect. I wouldn't say that any true crime is perfect or that that should even be the goal of it, I don't think. But, or even that it should be what happened, because it's really impossible to know like the details of a lot of this stuff or what it would feel like to go through it. But to their credit, I think that they have at least reached out in empathy enough that it has kind of changed how true crime is presented, I think, these days. So I don't know, give or take, but it was kind of, I think that there's definitely a criticism to be had of like not taking it seriously and not focusing too much on the killers, not focusing on the victims, but they are also pretty clear about what the podcast is.
Yeah. I I personally don't have any skin in the game. My wife used to listen to a lot of true crime when she worked an office job, and then I think at some point it seemed like she just hit a threshold and then just stopped doing it altogether, which kind of mirrors my like teens fascination with school shooters, which developed into a fascination with cult leaders, which hit a threshold, and now I don't know. The one thing about true crime that you kind of touched on that I find interesting is it does seem like, I remember when I first like noticed a true crime book section in a bookstore. I was quite young, and it felt very like, it felt like a thing for like older men. And as I became an adult where I might have enjoyed that, it has seemed like it's clearly much more of a female audience. And I'm noticing like similar things happening with fantasy novels too. And again, no skin in the game or whatever. But it is interesting to watch these previously male dominated art forms really take like a really hard turn into, we got to get ladies buying this stuff.
Totally. Yeah, you look at even like a horror, if you look 20 years ago, it was so normal to have no women on any anthology lineup. You look at, I was just watching Masters of Horror again because it's free to watch on Tubi, and I was just kind of appalled because it's like, where are the women? Like, where are the people of color? Like, where is anybody other than, these guys who are legends, but also where's everybody else? There's other legends. Like, where's Mary Harron? She, where there's plenty of directors that could have been called in, but they weren't considered masters of horror for whatever reason at that time. So this idea that as time goes on, I think women, queer people, a lot of groups, I think, are just kind of like, you must actually represent us because we are here.
Mm-hmm.
And so that idea, I mean, yeah, I've had people call women in horror a rarity, and you just kind of go, sure, not really. I think you just, at this point, you don't really have any excuse, right? Because there's so many horror movies, books, everything that are directed, written by women, there's just, to me, there's more of it. But yeah, I know what you mean. A lot of these, I mean, I'm a big comic book fan. Comics have had a huge turnaround in what their general demographic is as well.
Yeah. Well, and that's, I guess, kind of where I wanted to go too, with your comics knowledge, because that's another thing I remember back when I still had a Facebook account, arguing with old high school classmates. This is like in the midst of Gamergate, right? Like,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
and just being like, no, guys, I'm pretty sure making the characters wear clothes isn't gonna ruin anything.
I know.
But yeah, and again, I don't know how true crime or fantasy or horror or comic books would have been like 20 years ago. But at this point, like, it really does seem like you have to almost make an effort not to include women and people of color and queer stories in your repertoire as a reader.
Yeah, you'd really kind of have to duck to the side, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like a lot of the most acclaimed stuff has been by, women, people of color, queer people. This has been kind of an ongoing thing. But then you're also like, the way that they would kind of get around it before would always just be to not include some of the greatest horror writers of all time as being horror writers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's like Mary Shelley invented multiple genres, okay? Like, and then you have somebody like Shirley Jackson, who was just such a genius, but people would be like, that's literature, that's not horror. And it's just like, it's horror. Like, it can be both,
Yeah.
it can be both. You're willing to accept that Stephen King can be both, so why can't Shirley Jackson be both? But people would call that like women's fiction or whatever. Or you have something like one of my favorite books, you talk about kind of like a haunted estate, Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier.
Mm.
That is almost always classified as a romance story, but that is a story that is just beginning of book to end of book is about ghosts and jealousy. That's it. And so it's a horror story. So you look at it and you're like, how did this get misinterpreted as being like the great romance or something? Is like, this man kills his wife, like, in the context of the story.
Mm-hmm.
And people are just like, oh, but it's a love story at the end. And you go, what? But so I think it's just kind of this ongoing idea of like, well, women don't write horror.
Mm-hmm.
There's just no women in horror. And then looking all the way back, you're like, that simply is not true. Like, it's just not.
Yeah, I think, like, Daphne du Maurier was presented to me as like a thriller writer, which I have a hard time parsing what horror and thriller are.
Yeah, I get
Especially
that
once I
too.
started seeing people make the case that slasher movies are just action movies. Um, Now my brain, what likes compartmentalization, is like, oh no, oh, do I just not like slashers then?
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. Oh, I wanted to ask you, have you read My Heart is a Chainsaw?
I have. I really, really like Stephen Graham Jones. Good stuff.
Okay. Yeah, I was hoping. I read that last month. And felt like it had, like, you could have a conversation between the Scream zine and My Heart is a Chainsaw.
True. Yeah. I believe that I actually don't remember when I read it. It might have been right around the time that the Scream zine was released, actually. And I remember having similar thoughts. Now there's so much commentary on final girls in horror. It's something I didn't really explore too much in the zine, but I
Hmm.
definitely mentioned like, so you know that Sydney actually isn't the final girl, right? Like there are more final girls to come. And, so now you've got, the final girl support group. I read a really good story and I really wish I could remember what it was, where a final girl surviving like a slasher film, it coincides with like transitioning, right? And
Mm.
so this whole story was just about how like it's called Who the Final Girl Becomes. And actually, I don't remember the writer, but I believe it was either in Nightmare or Dark magazine. I don't remember which one. But it's really good. It's incredible. And so you're seeing these kind of evolutions of like what final girls can do, I guess. But it's all meta commentary at this point after Sydney.
Yeah. Dominique Dickey in Nightmare Magazine.
Great.
Um,
Yeah, it's a really good story.
Let me just go ahead and bookmark that real quick.
Yeah.
All right. Um, I also liked the little section. Do final girls have to vote conservative? Something to that effect was what you called it. I found I remember watching. There was a brief point where I was the stay-at-home dad, and we also had Shudder, and the baby was like newborn, so I could watch whatever I wanted on TV. So I watched like Shudder had a documentary series about queer horror,
Right.
which talked about and was not the first place I had heard the idea that like slashers are morality tales. And in my notes, I wrote something to the effect of just that is not like a satisfying interpretation for me.
Right.
Not necessarily thinking that it's incorrect or anything, just that I find it unsatisfying.
Yeah. I mean, it's reductive, but it's also, there is like and it's also changed quite a bit, I would say, because many slashers do have kind of conservative values sort of baked into the concept. But then it is a little bit deeper than that because you start to be like, well, this is such a subversive genre. Like slashers are considered to be like the lowest form of art. And probably not now, but
Yeah.
certainly in their early heyday. Like people will walk away from Wes Craven whenever they found out that he was the one who directed Last House on the Left, right?
Mm.
So like this man was like regulated to horror for life and with one exception, right? And so it's basically that he got like really roped in and typecast as far as like what work he was able to do in Hollywood. And that's not necessarily a tragedy because obviously Wes Craven had like one of the greatest careers in Hollywood of the last 70 years or so. But I also think that there is something to be said about the way that, there is a lot of conservatism. I would say that now it's almost worse in some ways because, for instance, a character like Sidney Prescott talking about, like, well, now I have guns and now I'm married to a cop and like all of that. And kind of like, alongside Laurie Strode,
Hmm.
alongside Sally from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, alongside many of these other, like, a woman comes back in middle aged and it's like, now she's tough. And it's
Hmm.
like, that's not necessarily how it goes. I'm like 41 years old and I don't feel like I've gotten like harder, I guess. Like I don't think that that's really happened. And if anything, it just feels like, yeah, I don't know. There my skin just gets thinner and thinner as time goes on. So I don't know. It's like I can't speak to it because obviously I have not been multiple times terrorized by a knife wielding killer, but I just always find it fascinating that nobody really explores what it would look like if somebody had gone through this and their response wasn't let me get 10 guns. And that's always another thing that kind of it makes it more sad almost in a way. It's not, people go, oh well, she's come back and now she's got guns or whatever, and it's just like, to me that's kind of tragic, because that shows how much the violence of her life has really changed the course of her life. And I find that just to be kind of sad, I think. And it's not explored as sad. It's not explored as anything other than like, yeah, now she's tough. Now she's like got killer instinct. Now she's like, all of this. And so honestly, I wish kind of that I had gone a little bit harder on that chapter, like right after, obviously, like right after the zine was released, obviously, like the election happened again, and now we're living in this kind of hellscape. And so I was thinking about how I probably should have been a little bit harder on my fellow white women, just in general, in that zine, because you go through a lot in life, but it doesn't necessarily justify certain actions. And it's not necessarily always going to be the heroic thing to go in guns blazing, right? And I think that Sydney was even more heroic maybe in, Scream 4, where she's really reaching out to people on an emotional level, right? And she's not afraid to fight. Like, she's always called herself a fighter, but she's her care, I think, is what defined her.
Yeah. I almost wonder if, like, the Halloween Laurie Strode sort of thing is almost like a protracted rape revenge film type thing, right? Where, like, a sort of flippant comment while you were talking that popped into my mind is like, well, it's extra horrifying because these killers also, like, stole these women's femininity, right? Like, they were very, the final girl archetype is one who's kind of like the ideal girl, ideal
Right.
teen girl, who then gets turned into like some woman named Dawn at a Denny's who has a million guns
Yeah.
in her basement. Like, that's if you're really invested in the, you know, gender binary or whatever, like that in itself is like, oh well, he kind of killed her anyway, because
Yeah.
she's not really, yeah.
She'll never be the same, right? And her entire life has been defined by this. And that's a big thing in Halloween, is her life is defined by
Mm-hmm.
it. Every choice that she makes is defined by what has happened to her before. And I don't think that that's necessarily untrue of any of us. I think that we all have a lot of anything horrible that happens to humans, like, we have a hard time letting it go. We have a really hard time moving on. If we are under constant threat of danger, then it's really hard to live in a world where that's not true. I think that that is definitely something that they do address in Halloween. So, not to be reductive to Laurie Strode, because I know a lot of people really love her too, and I
Mm-hmm.
love her as well. I get it. But I always think, that is sad. It is sad that she does kind of end up in the, like, living in the woods alone, and even her family won't talk to her. And she has to have like a redemption arc with them, kind of, where she's trying and she's like, oh, I was right all along. And it's like, but what if you weren't? Like, is this really how you want to live your life either way? And so I always just kind of wonder about that stuff. I appreciate that it's tackling trauma, right? It's talking about PTSD, how horrible things can affect you and really affect your relationships going forward. But, it's sad that that is kind of like the only way this story can go, is the way that Hollywood has portrayed it recently, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I remember having a discussion with someone years ago, kind of to that effect, how like I I would find it sad that someone is like on one path of life and then they get cancer and like get better, and then like now my entire life is about like advocacy for cancer treatment or awareness or something, and it's like, oh, like, well, that's good obviously, but that is like, that's sad to me that like you wanted to be an engineer and now you're giving TED Talks about pancreas cancer or whatever, like,
Right.
um and an aspect of that thought has been kind of creeping in the past couple weeks, where it's like, okay, I can't be whatever I thought I was going to be in 2014 or whatever. Like, it's 2025, and I have to come to terms with the fact that, like, there are things about me that are different because of external factors, and there are, like, my values are either different or being expressed differently because of external factors. And that's a bummer. But I guess even without, like, the big stuff, like, you're always kind of just, you're reacting to your environment too. I don't know.
True. I think one of the movies that successfully deals with this topic, it would be When a Stranger Calls Back, which is the sequel, obviously, to When a Stranger Calls. It has Carol Kane in it, and again, and Carol Kane, many years down the line from the original film, is working with people who have been traumatized by the same general things that she went through. Like, she's helping victims of stalkers. And the whole story kind of is about her helping someone who, quite literally, almost the same exact thing that happened to her is happening to this new person. And, I find that to be a very interesting topic of discussion. And it's just rare for any media to deal with it in such a real way. And, I found that to be pretty fascinating. But I don't think Scream is going to deal with it. Like, that's kind of the criticism I think sometimes that I have of Scream, is it really floats a lot of ideas, but it never really gets into it too much.
Yeah. Yeah. Lampshading seems to be kind of an issue that we as the audience have yet to really force them to reckon with. One of the notes I wrote down that I guess we kind of touched on, I just wrote down, it's more interesting to be the killer than it is to be killed, which I think ties in with what we were saying about true crime, and I guess also why within the Scream universe so many people decide to put the mask on, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you see, I mean, and as the movies go on, you were mentioning the two that you remember the most are the first two. As once you get into four, you start to see, or even three, honestly, you start to see how people are really glorifying Ghostface. And it is to the detriment of the people who have survived the killings and the dead, obviously. Something that I think Scream is successful in doing is making you really, really care about the victims. There are many, many characters that I care a lot about.
Mm-hmm.
And, they have tragic deaths and it really sucks. But that's kind of, I think, what Scream is good at, is definitely going, okay, these people who died were funny and cool and smart, and they didn't deserve to die. So I appreciate that about Scream. But then, like, kind of the idea, I guess, of fleshing it out more is something maybe that Scream isn't very well equipped to handle sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I feel like I think about the movie Cabin Fever a lot, and how I root against those people so much.
Yeah, sure do.
And maybe that's just an Eli Roth thing, because Green Inferno is kind of like that too, where it's just like, yeah, man, just eat them.
Yeah.
These guys suck. But I think maybe that's a different take you can take on the slasher final girl thing, is less sort of the final girl's purity and more just the fact that, like, these other people would be alive probably, or would have made it longer had they not been so self-absorbed and ready to just, like, party in the woods at all costs sort of thing, right? Like, I guess it has less to do with morality and more to do with, like, yeah, there's teenagers who, like, are just not aware of their surroundings.
Oh yeah, and I mean that's the thing is often the message is morality, but I always go, oh my God, because people we love to watch a horror movie and be like, no, don't go in there, like this is so stupid, and then you go, yeah, but how often? 90 times a day I do something so stupid. So like I've dropped my keys, I'm like tripping while I'm running, all of the things that we do all of the time, it becomes a trope because it happens so frequently in horror. And it's a way of like maybe not taking women seriously and like all of that, right? Like I can't escape because I just keep falling down.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also this, so Sydney's criticism of horror is correct, right? Like there's moments where it's correct, but it's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily indicate the whole story because I love a horror movie that has forgiveness to a fuck up character
Mm-hmm.
because you just go, yep,
Yeah.
that's
Um,
me.
yeah. I appreciated the AI statement at the beginning of the Scream
Ah,
zine.
thank
Um,
you.
I have I guess been less uh bearish on AI than a lot of people. Um, but that's kind of like beside the point at this time. Like
Yeah.
I did an episode with two like computer scientists who are also writers to talk about like using it as a texture, how it like whatever. But at this point, like that's so theoretical as to
It's gonna
like
boil the ocean no matter what we say at
yeah.
this point. Yeah, for sure.
But I did like how at the end of it you mentioned that it sort of helped you realize how you wanted to make art going forward. So how do you want to make art going forward?
By myself. That's been kind of the element because I was a professional writer for many years. I worked in kind of writing about movies and TV and comic books. I worked at Sci-Fi Wire. I've worked at a bunch of different places, and those places. God bless anybody who's still in those places. Like, for instance, I know that there's a bunch of great people still working at IGN, for instance, great writers doing great stuff. But it's almost undeniable that to write at any of those places, you are under a pretty strict criteria of what you can write about, how long it can be, all of this, right? And God knows it still doesn't pay enough, right? But at the same time, I started to really die. Like my writer self started to really die writing at those places because it was all listicles. It was all these kind of short, and in my opinion, I wasn't really allowed to flesh things out. And so something like the Scream scene was very directly in response to that. It was in response to the fact that AI essentially did kill my job, right? And then also that there is like still some spots for people if they can fight their way to them or whatever, or if they were in them and they haven't gotten mass layoffs yet. And hopefully they never do. I don't want to be flippant about that. It's horrible to lose your job like that. But the strict criteria under which I was writing made me no longer want to be a writer. And I burned out so hard. It took me like a year to get over it. And during that year, I was struggling with the Scream zine because I felt I had tried to pitch a piece and the piece, like, kind of the editor ghosted, like, for any number of reasons. I don't want to be rude. I know that we're all going through a lot. But, the editor kind of dropped off the face of the planet. And so I just had this piece that I didn't have anything to do with. And I was like, God, I can't figure out what I want to say about Scream because I feel often that Scream doesn't say anything. Like, Scream makes fun of horror, but sometimes it doesn't say it anything. Like it's like, is this a conservative point? Is this a progressive point? I can't tell what you're saying. Like, you're not saying it quite with your chest. And kind of the format of Scream, I think, lets them get away with that. And so I had a lot of trouble being like, so what do I want to say? What do I want to say? And kind of going through the zine at the same time as I'm having this like terrible burnout, it was hard to finish that zine. it was hard to flesh it out and to find a trail of conversation that I really wanted to follow. And so it was work. And the whole time I was just like, I'm so glad that I'm doing this work, because if I didn't do that work, I never get out of this hole of depression about writing and about our world. Like, I cannot leave it unless I start to understand what the hell I'm trying to say. And so you go, I have to work on this and I have to work on myself. AI can't do anything for me. Like, it can't help me at all. And it actually has been pretty harmful, I would say, in many ways. Let alone, I mean, I'm an environmentalist, so like it's not good.
Yeah.
But it has the capacity to be, but many things have the capacity to be. Like, I don't trust humans to do that. But it's just like this idea, though, that you have to work, I guess. And like, no matter what, even if you have AI helping you, like in quotations, I'm being kind of a dick about it, but you have to do the work no matter what. And so AI can't do the work for you. It can't. And so you have to do it. And that was kind of the point of saying, no, AI didn't do anything in this zine. I did it. And so if it's not good, I'm not good. Like, you have to address me, like, I'm not here on behalf of a corporation who is, writing about television, but only very strictly within this parameter. I did what I wanted and I said what I wanted. And that was why I felt like it was so important to also say, P.S., you can do this too. You should sit and work on your work. That's the thing. You will have emotional breakthroughs and you'll have a better experience with yourself. You'll know yourself better. Like, there was just so many things that I was going through at that time that it's just like, first of all, another thing I always say, making a zine always helps. It will always help you. Like, you will always feel better when it's done. And that was a big zine. So it took a long time, but it made me feel very good and at the end of it. And of course, people have responded very positively towards it, so that helps. But if everybody was like, this was not good, Sarah, then I'd be like, oh no. No, now I can be in, now I'll hear your argument about AI. but at the time I was like, I'm just so glad that I did it. And that's kind of the wonder of zines, frankly.
Yeah. I like that. What's your working definition of zine?
I guess it would be anything that you kind of cobble together yourself without necessarily having a publisher. I know that a lot of people do what they call zines through publishers, so I don't want to be disrespectful towards that either. I would consider that to be more publishing. You might be small press, but it's not necessarily quite the same as a zine. A zine often is made on a photocopier. Like, there's many criteria, I guess, but a lot of people would say this zine, the Scream zine, is like a weird, not normal zine, because I know that I've never gotten anything that looks like this when I bought a zine in the mail or whatever. So I don't know. I don't know that like zines that are film criticism is like a huge subgenre of zines or anything. And I've been making zines my whole life. I should also say that. But I would say a zine, it really takes you putting your whole back into it. And it's one of those kind of projects. It's a personal project. You're not necessarily aiming to even break even on them. But although you can, I would say that the Scream zine actually has sold really well. But yeah, you have this kind of, there's many elements to it, but more or less I'd say like you get to decide, because I can't listen to me. I'm like, I'm middle-aged. I don't have my finger on the pulse. I don't know what kids are doing with zines these days.
Sure. No, that's fair. I downloaded it and I was like, 60 pages. Oh no.
Yeah, that justifies the $14, right? I think the PDF is like $7. I was like, okay.
And I would have paid $7 for a third of that length anyway. And it didn't...
Appreciate it.
It didn't read like it was 60 pages. I don't know how to say that. It didn't take as long to read it as I thought it would.
I heard a lot of people just read it in one sitting and
Hmm.
they were like, the flow is great. And I'm like, that was like the hardest part to nail is just being like beginning to end, 60 pages, nail the flow and you're good. And so a lot of people saying that they just read it all in one sitting is like, great,
Yeah,
good.
I did. It might have been for me more by necessity, because it
Sure.
was yesterday that I read it. But uh, I definitely could have, had I bought it earlier last week or something, could have definitely sat down and read it in one sitting. Um, my my question is largely, question of definition is largely just because zine is something I'm seeing people doing more, mentioning more, a word that is being used more, where um, up until a couple years ago, it seemed largely like an antiquated term for something punks did in the 80s or whatever.
Sure. Yeah, I've gone to a lot of Zine Fest in my life. So I'm kind of too in it, I guess, to know, but I understand what you mean. Also, people don't necessarily super take self-publishing seriously. Like a lot of people will consider that to be like lesser. Oh, you weren't good enough to get it published.
Hmm.
And it's just like, I mean, I've been published like a lot of times. I could have done this as a series through a website or like something like that, but ultimately then it's for the website more than it is for me. So having something that I can continually make money off of after I do, like being able to make money off of my work is actually something that's becoming very important to me as I'm getting older and not just accepting like whatever lump amount and then it stays up for 10 years and makes tons of money for that company. I'm in a different state of mind now. So zines have been really good for that. I was making zines years ago, and usually they were like personal zines or they'd be art zines or something like that. I hadn't tried anything like this. This is now the vibe. This is how I want to do my writing. Because also you just get to be in charge of everything. Like I don't have to make it shorter. I don't have to make it longer. I don't have to, any of the issues. It's like make your own zine. You can say whatever the hell you want. It's awesome. I love my younger self for having so much dedication and just being able to do so many zines. And I don't know. I was happy for her that she got a writing job, but looking back, I feel like it was almost derailing to do professional writing on some level. It was good because a lot of more people found out who I was, I think,
Mm-hmm.
but you also go, well, was it good for you though? And that's the thing. Zines are always good for you. They're just always good.
Hmm. I like that. I have such a hard time with the self-imposed supposed tos
Mm.
of uh, everything. um, I think it has a lot to do with the way that I was raised, in a sort of like modernist way, right? Like it's just like there is a way things are to be done,
Yeah.
which has worked out for me quite well. Um, I I think that has a lot to do with things that don't have to do with me, or like my interior self. Um,
Sure.
but yeah, so it's always, I think that's something about like queer and trans art that I'm finding very energizing. Is I'll see a reel on Instagram of some trans girl who's like, "Here's a clip from my web series I'm making," and it's the most like insane multimedia extravaganza I've ever seen. That's like, oh, I had a flash of an image like that in my brain at 14, and then immediately was like, well, that's not how you do that.
Sure.
And then never did it again. But I guess, when you are with more important things than how you spend your free time hurtling over all those supposed tos, then just making art however you want to make it is probably a lot easier.
Yeah, I would say too that I don't know how I mean, I was raised really poor. I didn't get to go to college. I struggled a lot with not having housing, having like unstable housing. And so all of those things kind of combined, I think, to creating like what world do I exist in even? So it was kind of a surprise to get hired, at like any major publications, let alone repeatedly. But it was also this kind of like I wish sometimes the thing that makes me unique, I think, is all of the experiences that I've had. This is true of anybody, right? It's the thing that makes you unique. And I always loved zines. I kind of walked away from zines for a little while. And I think about that a lot is I was raised in such like a lawlessness. I had like lawlessness of like what place would ever accept me to work there anyway. So you start to kind of do things on your own. And I mean, when I was like a kid, I used to tell people stories, and then I would make it to the end of the story, and I would be like, "Okay, you have to give me 25 cents if I'm gonna finish this story." And so I was always like a little hustler, right? And like I always knew that art was like one of the things I could do, and it was one of the things that I could like leverage money out of. And so those two things kind of combined into like me selling punk zines at shows to total strangers, just walking up and being like, "Do you have $2? I'll give you the zine." Um, and all of those things, I think, I'm kind of coming back to it now. I feel like I got away from it with like a lot of those you should do this way. Or even just being like, wow, I can't believe they let me into the building kind of vibe. And now it's just like, yeah, but the building wasn't so great. Like it was fine outside of it. You can continue to create this outsider art. And to me, that's probably the most important thing. The Scream Zine never would exist in the exact format that it is if I had had any other stuff going on. So it's just been nice, I think.
Yeah. I like that idea of like coming back to something. Um like I feel like I don't know, anybody who's seen me posting on Blue Sky in the past couple of weeks like can see that like I'm kind of doing that too. Like um I think maybe that's one of the answers for 2025 is like what were you doing when you were 12 that you can do
Yeah.
now again? Um and like yeah, like I realize that I have allowed myself to be made lazy by convenience. And that like artistically, in addition to a plethora of other ways, like artistically, I have been harmed by that. Like
Sure.
I've allowed myself to become lazy, and then like I've allowed myself to expect convenience. And I think people who listen to multiple episodes of the show will note how I'm like allergic to editing. Largely, I think I kind of realized in the last episode because it takes so much time and is so difficult. Where like I learned in school that if I write a good enough first draft, then I can just pretend that I edited or just, bang out the 350 words the half hour before class and just be like, well, I'm a pretty good writer, so that's going to get an A. Um, and
I think that was me
yeah.
writing for a lot of platforms because it's
Mm,
like you don't really have the time to think because you won't make enough money if you sit around and think all day.
yeah.
You kind of have to go, "Bada, bada, bada, bada," here's my quick take on this or whatever. And yeah, it does because like you have to have kind of what is it like prolonged gratification or something to grow, I think. And
Hmm.
so having this idea, once again, the Scream Zine is just being like, this is taking so long. Will I ever finish it? And I did, but it was hard.
Yeah. Yeah, I dig it. I think Hunter S. Thompson did a lot of did a lot of boys a lot of harm with his gonzo journalism.
Oh
God,
yeah.
I remember I one of the it's back. It's off screen, but like a collection of his speeches and interviews, and in at least one of them, he refers to gonzo journalism as first draft journalism. And I remember reading it and it kind of breaking my heart because I thought gonzo journalism was something else.
Like honed.
Yeah,
Like
I
I
thought,
just came in and was so incisive.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was a sort of like you can train yourself to see the world in this sort of way. Um, but that training was actually just like a lot of mescaline or whatever. And I don't have the constitution for that sort of thing.
Who does other than that guy? Oh my God.
I know. The other thing I guess there's two things. But I think they tie in. I really appreciated how um in A Small Light and Other Stories you have an afterword where you have a little paragraph on every one of the stories.
I loved that too. Yeah, I was excited about that. I love it when other writers do that.
Oh God, it's so helpful. It's so
Yeah,
helpful. Like I appreciate the whole David Lynch like, I'm not gonna tell you about my movie. You just gotta watch the movie. Like that's great,
right.
David.
Thanks, David.
But man, would I have loved it if he had explained things once or twice.
Seriously.
The other thing is, and I think the afterword had it, but I know the Scream Zine had it, is this idea of you being quite clear about the reader ownership of the piece, or like very clearly saying it's in your hands now. You can do with it like it's like the suicide of the author or something, right? Like it's just like, all right, I did it. Now it's your
Goodbye.
turn. Yeah.
Yeah, like I'll try to explain it as well as I can. But then also, we change throughout our lives. So at a certain point, I feel very detached. Like if I looked at something I wrote like, I don't know, 15 years ago, I'd be like, who is this woman? Like, get her out of here. Like I have no idea who this is. I don't always relate to my younger self very much. And I think that also that she's like so like emotionally raw. If like you read like my early zines, they're so emotional and I'm just like, geez Louise, like this is a lot. Like sometimes I'm like, I don't know if this should be out in public. Like, but at the same time it was really important to me back then because I didn't necessarily have like a larger queer community. I mean, there were queer people in my community. I was always in like an artistic community, but I didn't necessarily have like that kind of one-on-one connection where we're like talking things out all of the time. So I felt like I kind of had to represent myself in that way, or just be like, here's something raw, I guess, that none of us talk about. But yeah, that kind of idea of just being like, it's on you now. Goodbye. I'm out of here. Because I am. Like it doesn't have that much to do with me anymore. Like whatever your experience with it is something that I cannot control. People have been super nice about my work many times throughout my life. And I'm so grateful to that. And it's also this idea of just kind of like, that's you doing that though, too. It's more of a conversation at that point, I think. Okay, so this is a reading from my Scream zine. It's called An Overview of the First Six Films, which is also hilarious because I didn't actually put the title anywhere on this zine. It's just a ghost face on the cover. So there is no title to the zine technically. But it is chapter 5. It is called They Killed Me in the Cold Open. And the quote, because all of the title pages come along with a quote from the Scream movies. And this one says, one generation's tragedy is the next generation's joke, which is something that Dewey Riley says in Scream 4. This is the only time I quote Dewey because I think he's a jackass mostly. But I also understand that he's a huge part of the franchise. I just don't talk about him very much in this scene because I'm just like, that's Gail's husband, right? Okay. So, the opening of each Scream film introduces us to a character that, in most other horror franchises, would be the main character. Casey Becker is the subject of our first cold open. She's charming and funny during her chat with Ghostface at first. Her responses soon descend into suspicion, then desperation, as she realizes that what she thought was a prank call has now turned into a horror show. In A Stranger Calls, which was released in 1979, Jill, who is played by the great Carol Kane, that part's not in the zine, but I love Carol Kane, is in a similar situation. But she survives the opening attack and even later returns in an underrated made for TV sequel about coping with PTSD. I bring this up all of the time. Not so with Casey. She very well may have seen When a Stranger Calls, but all of the media savvy quips in the world won't save her. She dies a devastating death, eviscerated in the grass while her parents search the house for her. She is hung from a tree for them to find moments after her demise. Her mother's screams fill the air as one scene shifts to the next. No matter how many times I see it, this opening still shocks me. Perhaps it is the proximity to real life. After all, a death like Casey's at the hands of a stalker is far from unheard of. When a Stranger Calls was inspired by an urban legend based directly on the real world murder of a 14-year-old girl named Janet Chrisman in Columbia, Missouri in the 1950s. The grisly similarities to real world cases make it all so terrifying and so heartbreaking. Casey's parents are never seen again, but it's hard to imagine that they will ever get over this moment. This death could have easily been non essential. No one knows Casey very well, and her murder is rarely taken seriously going forward. No, her death is parodied and cheered for in the in universe Stab series, but it is a gut punch. Casey's death sets the tone for the entire franchise, in which every slaying morphs into a motion picture based on a true story right before our eyes. The killer is a legend while the dead just disappear. Whoever they were is forever distorted through the eyes of people who will only ever see them as archetypes and morality lessons. This is not just what Scream does to its victims, this is what we do. What scares me the most about Casey's death is that the fourth wall is broken and it never goes back up. Casey considers watching a horror movie only to realize that she is in one. Her casual enjoyment of the genre becomes the weapon that is used to kill her. Somehow, the mortifying truth that her ex Stu is one of the people who stalks and murders her becomes incidental because the genre itself has fundamentally turned on her. Perhaps this opening still stings because I'm on Casey's side. I like her. Every time I see this film, even knowing what's to come, I want to negotiate with it. Maybe this time it could be different. Maybe. And I'm not the only one. A brief skit reviving Casey appeared on the Drew Barrymore show in 2020 titled What If Casey Becker from Scream Had Lived? Spoiler, in the age of cell phones, she simply ignores Ghostface texts. By now, Ghostface has become a classic Scooby-Doo villain. A series of killers hide behind the anonymity of the mask. They anxiously await their moment to recount their nefarious schemes, and they would have gotten away with it too if it weren't for, well, you know the rest. For instance, Scream 4's opening is hilariously meta. The violence of it is all so exaggerated and self-referential that when Jenny Randall and Marnie Cooper actually are killed, it's comparatively devoid of emotional impact. But Casey's death does the narrative work of telling us that all bets are off. Anyone can die and anyone could be a murderer. If not a killer, then a target, says Randy in Scream 2. Being a good person with a promising future doesn't protect you in real life, and it doesn't protect you here. Sometimes you're just in the wrong damn place at the wrong damn time. If there is a death that is more horrible than Casey's, that would be in Scream 2. Far from the isolation of the first cold open, the sequel begins at the screening of a film that is based on the events of the original film. This is Stab, which would go on to make regular appearances throughout the franchise. Maureen Evans, who is played by Jada Pinkett Smith, is out on a date with her boyfriend Phil, who is played by Omar Epps. He enjoys slashers for all the standard reasons, while Maureen is made uncomfortable by all of the same elements. Like Steve in the first film, Phil dies fast, stabbed through the head in a bathroom break. Maureen, who is adamant in her dislike of horror films, is killed while watching the film. She climbs onto the stage and shrieks for help while bleeding out. The audience is silent, uncertain if this is all part of the film's publicity. When Maureen falls, no one moves. When it comes to visceral scares, Maureen Evans' death might perhaps be the height of the Scream series. Pinkett Smith has commented in interviews that she insisted on giving Maureen the most devastating demise that they possibly could. In Casey's final moments, she's calling out for her mother. Maureen dies reaching out to a crowd of strangers. The whole time this is happening, a caricature of Casey's death is playing out across the screen behind her. That sequence is highly sexualized, with Heather Graham stripping down and stepping into a steamy shower before being slaughtered by Ghostface. There is the aggressive cruelty of the killer, and then there's the casual cruelty of us, our society, our disassociation with death, our tasteless jokes, our terrifying lack of care for each other. Maureen's death is all this and more. Stab and its sequels and are recurring gags throughout this film and others. At the same time, it's one of the most disturbing elements of the entire franchise. It's disquieting to watch Casey's death reimagined through a schlocky horror lens, warranting audience cheers, after we saw firsthand the devastation her parents experienced as they discovered her body in the prior film. But that was a schlocky horror lens too, wasn't it? The genre is the surface of Scream's meta-commentary, but the root is our society's disregard for victims of violent crime. You do it too, says Scream. We do it too. I do it too. In the sixth film, Amber Freeman argues that the biggest issue with the Stab series is that there is no single iconic villain. But the media landscape itself is the franchise's recurring, indefeatable enemy. Be it fandom gone awry or a horror nerd taking things way too far, Ghostface reflects the cruelty and the sensationalism of the media to jarring extremes. While individual characters may be good or bad, the media is a hungry maw that we all serve. This is true regardless of personal morality. In the case of Sydney, it's true regardless of how hard she tries to opt out. After the second film, the cold open gag continues, but it shifts in tone. Cotton Weary and Christine are Hollywood people, and so they are portrayed as being less sympathetic victims. The fourth film features a rapid-fire self-parody full of over-the-top violence, and the fifth introduces our first cold open survivor with Tara Carpenter. In the sixth, a film studies professor specializing in slashers is stabbed to death by a student in an alley. The twist this round is that the murder is more or less incidental to the plot, two starter ghost faces who never quite get off the ground. While these moods certainly have their place, their introduction nonetheless steers the franchise in a different and more farcical direction. The last few cold opens kill or nearly kill characters that intellectualize horror movies. In Scream 4, a woman is stabbed during the cold open for talking during a cold open. In Scream 2022, Tara's pretentious claim to enjoy elevated horror earns her a bloody attack straight out of a B-grade slasher flick. In Scream 6, the film studies professor rolls her eyes at her own scholarly description of slashers, only to be murdered by a garden variety Ghostface cosplayer. At the risk of being killed in the next cold open, I always find it a little dissonant to watch Scream commit to being the most meta horror franchise of them all, while also regularly positing that intellectual evaluation of horror is inherently fraught, if not completely futile. Memorizing horror trivia may be the trick to survival, but if you search for greater meaning, you will find nothing but the void.